Hello, we're going to be concluding the book of Nehemiah today. So let's turn to Nehemiah 13. Notice where it says, "And on that day they read aloud from the book of Moses." That tells me two things. Number one, that the Pentateuch was in place at this time. Ezra seems to know of it. Matter of fact, remember Ezra read from the law back in Ezra chapter, can't read my own writing, chapter 8, 1 through 8. That's Nehemiah 8, I'm sorry. And he read from the law. Now the question's been here, was this a casual, and not in the sense of being informal, but a non-specified reading of the law like Nehemiah 8? Or was it connected with the Feast of Tabernacles where the reading of the law was required? And we're not certain here, but we think it's one of those two. Now you can see that reading being required in Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 11. Okay, notice where it says, "Hearing the people, and there was found written in it, no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God." Now this seems to be a direct quote from Deuteronomy 23, 3 through 5. And so you might want to check that. Now this little phrase, the assembly of God, this is the only place in the Old Testament where the word kahal, which means assembly, and the word Elohim are used together. Usually it's always the kahal of Yahweh. Now I think it's interesting that the Septuagint translation, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, done around 250 BC, translates this into the Greek word ekklesia. Now that's our modern word for church out of the Greek New Testament. So what it tells me is that New Testament authors picked this word kahal to translate ekklesia, a town assembly in the New Testament, to say we are the same people of God as the Old Testament people. And the reason that's significant is that's exactly what Ezra and Nehemiah wanted to make certain. We are the remnant of the children of Jacob. We are the promised seed. It was so important to them, and apparently it was important to the early church who picked up on the same word, kahal, for church, ecclesia. Now, this Ammonite and Moabite, these are the two tribes, if you'll look at a map of Judah, that are directly across of the Jordan River and somewhat down by the Dead Sea. And these, of course, come from the children, one of them, of Lot, by his daughters. And so they were not allowed in the assembly of Yahweh because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them. And this comes from Numbers 22, verses 3 through 11. And of course, this Balaam is the one whose donkey talked to him. And this was an attempt to get a God's prophet to curse God's people. And Balaam couldn't do it, but Balaam told the king how he could do it. If you remember, they sent the Moabite women down into the camp, and the Israelites condemned themselves by their sexual acts. And that's the illusion here. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. And of course, that's the idea that Balaam could not curse them, and he had to bless them verbally. Now, notice in verse 4. "Now, prior to this, Elisab, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers." Now, I'll go back to chapter 12, verse 44, for these storage chambers around the temple area. Okay? Of the house of God, being related to Tobiah. Now, Tobiah is one of these Ammonites. And he is the one who has caused Nehemiah the miseries, I want to tell you. Look back in chapter 6, 17 through 19. He was obviously a friend of Sanballat, the Samaritan. He was obviously trying to thwart the rebuilding of the walls over and over and over again with trickery and intrigue and everything. And now he even had a room in the temple, if you can believe that. Well, Nehemiah was just shocked. He just could not believe it. Notice this. Verse 5. "And prepared a large room for him, where formerly they put grain offerings and frankincense, the utensils, the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contribution for the priest." Now this grain offering was the special ground flour that was used in the morning and evening sacrifice, as well as required for other sacrifice. The frankincense was part of the incense that was put in the holy place every day. Now you notice the tithes here, the grain, the wine, prescribed for the Levites. The children of Israel were to tithe to the Levites. And notice it says the contribution for the priest. The Levites, who weren't priests, were to tithe to the priest. And so the priest got a 10% of the Levites' tithe plus some of the things that were offered on the altar, part of the sacrifices. Now, notice it says, "But during all this time I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king." Now, remember he was in Jerusalem as governor from 445 to 433 BC, 12 years. But now he's gone back to the court of Artaxerxes the first. And how long he's gone, we're not sure. But apparently he returned. It was long enough time that this corruption had reoccurred. And one of the reasons that people don't know the relationship for certain between Ezra and Nehemiah is because the very same thing that Nehemiah is going to talk about in this chapter, Ezra talked about at Ezra 9 and 10. So either Ezra's reform failed or Ezra's reform was later, and that's been the argument throughout the relationship of these two books. Now it says king of Babylon. That sounds unusual, but we know that Cyrus and Cambyses and Darius the First was called king of Babylon as well as king of Persia. So maybe this title continued into the reign of Artaxerxes the First. We're just not sure. We would expect king of Persia. Notice what it says, "For some time, however, I asked leave from the king." Now, after an appropriate time, a year or two, he said, "May I go back and see?" Or the Jews had written letters to him saying, "Oh, please send back Nehemiah. Things aren't going well here." Whatever, we're just not certain. "And I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Elisab had done for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God." He was not a Jew, much less a Levite or a priest, and here he had a special room in the house of God, and the priestly tithes and contributions had been taken away. Well, it was horrendous. It was an affront to who God is because of the holiness of that temple area. And if you look down in verse 10, the reason there was no need for that room is they quit paying the Levites, and the Levites had to go back to work to make a living, and the temple was in disuse. The regular services had ceased. And so you see the implication. Tobiah is still trying to undermine the government, the political structure, and the worship structure. And that's what we have here. Notice what Nehemiah did. "Then I gave an order, and they cleansed the rooms, and I returned there the utensils of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense." Well, Nehemiah cleared it up fast and threw that fella out. Now in verse 10, we see another part of the problem, which was that, as I mentioned, these Levites had not been paid. "I also discovered that the portion," that's 1/10 of the offering of the tribes, of the Levites had not been given them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. Now, we find something of these offerings from Numbers 18, 21 through 32, and this describes their gifts. What they were to get, what the people were to give them, and you might want to look at that, okay? It was for their livelihood. Now, when it says each to his own field, we understand from the book of Joshua, chapter 21, verse 3, and earlier recorded in Numbers 25:8, that each Levite had a little plot of ground to kind of grow vegetables on and the things he didn't receive from the offerings. And so they had just gone back to this little piece of ground to make their living from. And that's the state that Nehemiah found the temple in. Now listen in verse 11 where it says, "So I reprimanded the officials." The problem throughout Nehemiah had seemed to be not foreigners so much, but these rich, powerful Jewish leaders who did not want a stable Jewish government. They just wanted to make money for themselves. Now, the word reprimanded is this very famous Hebrew word rib, or riv, however you pronounce it. Now, it was mentioned back in chapter 5, verse 7, where he contended. It meant a legal law case. It's a very significant word in the book of Jeremiah. It's used in this chapter in verse 11, verse 17, and verse 25 that shows that Nehemiah took legal procedures against these wealthy Jewish aristocracy. And they're the ones that are causing the problem. I read one commentator and said, the rich in the church have always been a problem. And there's some truth in that. There's some real truth in that. Now, notice where I mentioned in verse 13, "And in charge of the storehouse I appointed." Now, there are going to be 4 men mentioned here. This verse, verse 13, is used by many to say when Ezra arrived, there were already 4 treasurers appointed. So this is one of the evidences that they use that Ezra came after Nehemiah. And they usually do it in two different ways. Change Ezra 7:7 from 7 years of Artaxerxes to 27th year of Artaxerxes, or they say it's not Artaxerxes the first at all, but Artaxerxes the second. So they're trying to make Ezra later, and this is one of the proof texts they use. But listen, we can't base it on that. The temple had fallen in disrepute. Nehemiah may have been reappointing someone, or at least reappointing some faithful people that Ezra had earlier established. So we can't use this, I don't believe. Now in verse 14, we have this common refrain that we have found throughout Nehemiah. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot me out of the royal deeds which I have performed for the house of God and his servant. I even read one commentator that said, obviously Nehemiah did not understand the grace of God. What a bunch of baloney. This is a godly man. What he's saying is he's a eunuch. He doesn't have any children after him. He's saying, oh God, don't forget me. Now, the reason I believe that, notice the word royal deeds. This is that special Hebrew word hesed, which means God's covenant loyalty. Now, he's using it here for his deeds, but look down in verse 22 where he uses the same word for God's loving kindness. Now, I believe he had a good understanding of who God is and what God was about in his world, but he said, oh God, remember me. I don't think that's wrong. You must admit that the concept of grace in the Old Testament is not as articulated as the concept of grace in the New Testament. And you must admit that God had just taken these very people into exile for the very sins that they were beginning to do again. And Nehemiah says, oh God, remember me. And he said that over and over again. I don't think he's trying to get God's love by what he does, but he loves God, and he's saying, God, I've done this because I've loved you. Don't forget me. Well, I think that's an appropriate prayer. I don't think it's works righteousness at all. Now, in verse 15 it says, here's another problem. Not only the mixed marriages, and not only the temple was in unuse, but they were working on the Sabbath. Look at verse 15. In those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath. Now this passage is very similar to Jeremiah 17:19 through 27, where Jeremiah says God brought the exile because they had abused the Sabbath in this very way. And what shocks Nehemiah and Ezra so bad, the very sins that caused God to bring on the exile are the very incipient sins that are beginning again in the remnant community. It was a serious thing for them. Look at this. And bring in sacks of grain and load them on donkeys, as well as wine and grape and figs and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Not only were they working in the fields, but they were bringing it into the holy city where it was supposed to be set aside a special temple service. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. And also the men of Tyre were living there, who imported fish of all kinds of merchandise. Now these men of Tyre are mentioned for their importing of fish in the famous commercial chapter of the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 27 verses 12 through 36, and again in Ezekiel 28:16. They were famous for their importing of fish. The Jews love to eat fish and still do a lot today. So you can see that there. Many think that the fish gate in Jerusalem was related to this traffic of importing fish. And it was happening even on the Sabbath in Jerusalem. These men were bringing loads into the holy city. Notice verse 17. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah. They're the ones that were involved behind this commerce. They're the ones that were trying to make a buck even on the Sabbath. And so again he brings this word that means a legal charge against these Jewish nobles or princes. Okay? And said to them, what's the matter with you? Well, he didn't quite say that. That's what he meant. What is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your father do the same, so that God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? See, apparently Nehemiah knew Jeremiah's prophecy. Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Boy, he puts the bite on them, and he should have. They were not living up to the light they had. It's not so much works righteousness, but God revealed what he wanted from them in the Pentateuch. They had heard it read, and they violated it, knowing the very thing brought earlier exile, because they wanted to make a little more money. God help us, sometimes the love of money is the major problem in our society. It's so materialistic today. Now, notice where it mentions here, let's see. Okay, verse 19. And it came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath. Now remember, the Jews start at 6 o'clock in the evening. That's why all that's happening in the Gospels. When Jesus died about 3 o'clock, he had to be buried before 6 because the high holy Sabbath of Passover starts at 6 p.m. on Friday and goes to 6 p.m. on Saturday. Now, the reason the Jews do that, they go back to Genesis chapter 1, where it says the evening and the morning were the first day. And so they follow that structure. Now, I command that the doors should be shut, and they should not open them until after the Sabbath. And then I station some of my servants. Now, whether it's his kinsman or his Persian guard, official Persian escort, or just some Jewish followers, we're not certain. Okay? Let's see. And notice verse 20. Once or twice the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside Jerusalem. Now, one or two problems. When they closed these big gates that the camels and donkeys couldn't get in, the carts and the wagons, they still had some small gates that men could walk through. And by these merchants being right outside the gate, the temptation was there for the Jews just to walk out the gate and get what they wanted and walk back in. So Nehemiah says, you can't stay here or I'm going to force you out. And so he ran them clear away from the gates of Jerusalem. By the way, I think the people who were on the walls could see these merchants. It reminded them of commercial things instead of religious things. It was a real problem. Then I warned them and said to them, I was going to mention one more thing here. Notice that in verse 19 through 22, a lot of folks, we've been fighting the blue laws. I'm from the state of Texas, and we've just repealed them, which used to mandate that stores close either Saturday or Sunday. Now, we just repealed that. Everybody was saying, well, you can't legislate morality. You can't keep these stores closed just because you have religious conviction. I want to tell you, that's what Nehemiah is doing. He's legislating morality. He's saying we're closing down on God's day. And if you stay here, I'm going to throw you out by force. Well, there's a biblical precedent. I realize that some of the people in Jerusalem had a bad attitude about the commerce being stopped. But it's important they kept the will of God to have a day of rest. Now, there's a word for our society. I don't want to be a legalist. I don't want to force my morals on others. But I have a God-called responsibility to influence the society in which God has placed me. Now, notice if you would, let's see. Okay, verse 22. And I command the Levites they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. Now, back in chapter 7, verse 1, we talked about what seemed to be inappropriate there with gatekeepers linked with Levites and singers. And many said in 7:1 that the Levites and singers were out of place. Remember from verse 43? But I say to you, Nehemiah had a view that all of this city belonged to God. And he took the Levites even to the city gates to purify themselves and make those gates holy. Now the rest of this chapter, earlier in the Nehemiah 11, we talked in 12 about the dedication of the city walls. Nehemiah saw this whole community as the holy city, dedicated to God. And even the city gates had a hollowness to them because of the presence of God. And so the Levites take control of the city gates. They're going to apparently have a worship service there because even the singers are going to come. Wow, isn't that something? Now, this also, remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me. And there's that same refrain. Look at verse 23. In those days, I also saw the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. This is the same problem that's covered in Ezra 9 and 10. Now, this is not interracial marriage. This is interreligious marriage. Now, let's look at it for a minute. As for their children, half spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them were able to speak in the language of Judah. Now this half spoke, this is a Hebrew idiom, and scholars are divided. Some think it meant they spoke in a slang that was half of the Canaanite tribes and half of the Aramaic of the Jews. Or some saying half the children could speak Aramaic and half could speak only Ashdod. We're not certain, but it seems they had a language that was a mixture of the two. Well, you can see the problem. If these children were growing up with mothers who taught them their native language, they also were going to teach them their native religions, and that was the problem. The problem has never been race in the Bible. Moses had a black wife. Joseph had an Egyptian wife. David had foreign wives. Solomon had foreign wives. I know it caused them the problems, but it was not the women's bloodline that was the problem. It was their religious commitment to these foreign gods. And that's the problem here. And boy, Nehemiah is as upset as Ezra, though he handles it a little different way. Now, Ezra fell down and cried, remember that, and shamed them into changing. Nehemiah's going to pull their beard out. One was a little more forceful. Remember, one was a government official and one was a scribe. There's quite a difference there. Now, verse 25. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God. Well, wow. Pulled out their hair, struck them, cursed them. Now this curse, you might want to see Nehemiah 10. It's just saying, I want you to swear to God you're going to put these wives away. And when they swore to God, there was a curse involved. If you don't, God will. And so obviously that's what it's talking. It's not like cussing. That's not what cursing is in the Bible. It's saying, I promise to do this in God's name, and if I don't do it, this is going to happen. Now, exactly how this legal procedure worked, we just don't know. But Nehemiah used his official Persian authority as a governor or visiting dignitary to clean this mess up legislatively. He didn't ask them if they wanted to close the gates. He didn't ask them if they wanted to institute the temple sacrifices again. He didn't ask them if they wanted their wives away. He said, look, guys, this is the way it is. How about that? Let's see. Oh, I made a note in the bottom of my Bible that I want to read to you and see if you buy what I say. Our day shows imbalance of an emphasis on individual freedoms versus the moral revelatory guideline. You know, in America, we're so excited about everybody having their rights and their privileges, be it children or women or minorities. Well, I want to tell you, the only rights these folks said is we're going to be truthful to the Word of God as we understand it. I'm sure there was some abuse that occurred. I'm sure there's some unfair things. But I want to tell you, we as Christians are responsible corporately for the society in which we live. And we're to pray for them, and we are trying to mold them into the forms that fit our understanding of the moral universe. And I know we're going to be criticized for that. We still got to do it. There will be more Christians in government acting appropriately and unselfishly for the cause not simply of man or a nation, but the cause of God. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? And boy, did he not. 1 Kings 11. When he was old, he just kept marrying these foreign women, and he even built houses of worship and imported priests into Jerusalem for these foreign women. The wisest man ever lived became the dumbest that ever lived. And it was happening all over again. Now, notice verse 11. We do not hear about you that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God by marrying foreign women. God told them what to do. They violated it. It was unfaithfulness. Even one of the sons of Jehoiada, and here we have the high priest family. Even the high priest family was marrying foreign women. And look who he married. The daughter of Sanballat, the Horonite, who was the leader of the Samaritans. Not only was the high priest friends of Tobiah the Ammonite, but one of his sons married the Samaritan leader. Do you see how this was a slap in the face at Nehemiah? Oh my goodness, I bet he could have croaked. Look what he did. So I drove him away from me. He exiled the man, sent him out of the country, wife, goods and all. Now probably what happened, he told him to put this woman away and he wouldn't do it. He said, fine, you go back home with her. Josephus relates a later experience like this, a Jew being sent away with his foreign wife about the founding of the Samaritan temple, but I'm not sure we can link it here at all. Remember me, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Now here's that same refrain, remember me. Now what this covenant of the Levites is, we don't know. There's nothing in the Bible to correspond to this, so we're not sure at all what it means by a covenant. But obviously it's talking about the high priestly family who promised they would have certain guidelines for their family life, certain guidelines for their bloodline, and they had forgot all that and intermarried these foreign women. Now look at verse 30. So I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each to his task. This government official got in the middle of the clergy and said, okay, guys, you can't handle it. I'll handle it for you. Here's what you're going to do. Here's when you're going to do it. And here's how you're going to do it. Woo-hoo! Don't you know those Levites had a fit and those priests? Well, goodness sakes. And I arranged for the supply of wood at the appointed times and for the first fruits. Now, this is the idea of the wards. Remember, David divided the priest into 24 divisions. Well, they retained that. And so what Nehemiah is doing is saying, now this group's going to do this on this day, and this group's going to do this on this day. He's kind of reinstituting this division of labor among these Levites. And then he says again, remember me, oh my God, for good. And that's where the book closes, with Nehemiah legislating the appropriate morality for the remnant community who can't seem to keep their vision on what God wants. So here are those who God spared doing the very things that the whole community was exiled for. Well, it shows human nature. It also shows how we continue to get away from God. And it shows the depth of man's fallen nature, even in the presence of God's great acts and love. That's why we're just one generation away from complete apostasy. We must pass on to our kids not only the rules, but the faith behind the rules, that when things get hard, they're not going to go towards self and money and world and popularity, which so easily distracts us. And Nehemiah says again, oh God, I've done the best I know. Remember me. That's a good prayer. For you know, when it comes down to it, all we can do is respond to God in faith and love with the best light we have. You say, well, he was a legalist. He should, whatever good or bad was his actions as far as individuals having the right attitude when they performed them, Nehemiah did what he thought was the will of God. And I think God is going to bless him for that. I think God will bless anybody who's living up to the light they have in love and seeking to know more light through their closer walk with God in Christ. What about you? Are you walking with Him? Are you doing what you know? Most of us keep praying, oh God, show me more your will, when we're not doing the will that we know. Hang in there. I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.